All right. Good afternoon. I am the dramatic historian, Dr. Nathan Provost, and I'm lucky enough to be speaking to John Horn, who is the author of a variety of different books. But the one that we're going to be talking about today is Lee Besieged, Grant's Second Offensive, or Grant's Second Petersburg Offensive, June 18th to July 1st, 1864. Thanks for coming on, John.
You're welcome.
All right. So really to start off, one of the arguments that you start out with right away is actually to simply question why Grant's Second Petersburg Offensive is among the least understood operations of the entire campaign. Why do you think this has been so persistently overlooked by former historians? And feel free to give as much background on this as you want.
I didn't think that the records were on the offensive were that great. And I think that even Douglas Southall Freeman got some of the facts mixed up. He had the events of the 23rd occurring on the 22nd, I think, at one point in either, I think it was Lee's lieutenants. And it's a complicated narrative. There's always talk about how the Confederates got in between the Second Corps and the Sixth Corps. Well, it's more like they got in between the two lines of the Second Corps. It takes a while to grasp that the Second Corps was deployed in two lines and that the Confederates got in between them. And then trying to figure out what the dispute was between Mahone and Wilcox that lasted for the rest of their lives. That is, it took me a while to figure that out. I laid that to A.P. Hill and his misunderstanding of what Mahone had in mind. So,
sure. And maybe for some of our listeners, they don't understand the concept of this offensive, right? This is the second offensive. How would you go about characterizing this? I'll call it for now the unorthodox siege of Petersburg. What are we talking about in terms of offensives? Because I think this is the part of the story of the Civil War where I think a lot of people start getting a little bit confused, especially in terms of Petersburg, because as you already mentioned, it's complicated. We've had past historians that have made mistakes trying to write about it. So if you would kind of explain that a little bit more.
Well, the historians break down on what the offensives were, but they agree that there were 9 of them. Okay, there was the first offensive from June 15th to June 18th with the assaults on the eastern side of Petersburg. Then there was this offensive, which tried to extend the federal line from the Jerusalem Plank Road to the Appomattox River above the city. Then the third offensive was wound up with the crater. The fourth offensive finally cut the Weldon Railroad after moving north of the James River. The fifth offensive followed the same pattern as a thrust north of James River that was probably the most effective of the thrusts there, and then a move south of the river to extend the federal lines west of the Weldon Railroad. In October, there was a thrust south of the river towards Boydton Plank Road and the South Side Railroad, but that was a really strange one because the Federals didn't reconnoiter. They didn't know that the Confederates had fortified all the way down to Hatcher's Run.
Yeah.
And Butler was supposed to demonstrate north of the James, but he converted it into an actual attack, which was a disaster. The seventh offensive, Nigel Lambert's running. Oh, wait a minute. That's the Weldon Railroad raid, generally, and of course, General Grant thought a lot more of the Weldon Railroad than General Lee did. General Lee wrote it off as indefensible the day after he got to Petersburg, which was the 19th of June. And then let's see, the eighth offensive, that's the one Nigel Lambert's written a book about. It's not published yet. It's a pretty good book. And the Federals thrust all the way to the Boydton Plank Road, but then were driven back. And finally, some people don't count one of those later offensives, probably the Weldon Railroad raid, and they break down the March and April fighting into two offensives, whereas another school of thought, and I agree with that, that's Dr. Summers, the late Dr. Summers's thought that all the fighting in March and April amounts to one offensive, and that's the final offensive, the ninth offensive.
Right. And so you actually mentioned right at the beginning, the Federals actually failed to actually capture the city of Petersburg. And then that's where your book really kicks off, is talking about what comes after that.
Correct.
Could you just briefly describe the terrain around that general area where the second offensive is going to take place? And by the way, when I say that, I'm specifically talking about the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road. Please don't feel like you need to explain the terrain with Kautz's raid, which we'll talk about in a second.
Well, the terrain that the second offensive the second offensive took place on is south of the river, south of the Dimmock line, west of Jerusalem Plank Road, east of the Weldon Railroad, and north of the second swamp. And it's full of woods and ravines and swamps and bad roads.
So in other words, it's not a great place for a battle to take place.
Well, it was part of the defense of Petersburg was its geography, getting around the city in an area with which the Federals weren't familiar.
Right. Well, your book, again, one of the amazing things about your books is how well you integrate the action at Jerusalem Plank Road with the Wilson Kautz raid as part of this single operational effort. So how does that integration change how we evaluate success or failure of this offensive?
Well, the integration all depends on what happened on the night of the 21st. As Wilson was going out on his cavalry raid, he asked Humphreys, who was the chief of staff of the Army of the Potomac, if he could come back to the Army of the Potomac if necessary, if the raid failed, because General Grant's intention was that Wilson would go out to Burkeville, about 45 miles west of Petersburg, then go down the Richmond and Danville Railroad, ripping it up, then capture and destroy Staunton River Bridge over the Staunton River, and proceed to General Sherman in Georgia. That was Grant's original idea. Well, Wilson considered other options and asked Humphreys, would he be able, if necessary, to return to the Army of the Potomac? And Humphreys, who should have known better, by that time, Humphreys knew that the first Federal infantry thrust toward the Weldon Railroad had failed, that where Barlow was ambushed by Behringer's North Carolina Cavalry Brigade, about a mile short of the Weldon Railroad, and Meade and Birney being the commander of the Second Corps at the time, because Hancock was having problems with his Gettysburg wound, they decided that instead of moving to the Weldon Railroad and then closing up to Petersburg, they would go up and start from the left of the Fifth Corps on Jerusalem Plank Road and extend left from there, much closer to Petersburg. So Humphreys knew that that first thrust had failed, and he also knew that General Sheridan, who was coming back from the Pavilion raid, had encountered Confederates in between him and Deep Bottom, so that he would not be able to cross the James on a pontoon bridge, but would have to cross about 10 miles downstream on boats, which would take much, much longer. Nonetheless, Humphreys said, "Don't worry about it, Wilson. Our infantry will have the city invested from Jerusalem Plank Road to the Appomattox above the city. And even if they don't, Sheridan will be able to keep the Confederate cavalry under Wade Hampton busy," even though he knew that things weren't going in that direction already. So that's why I structured the book the way I did, with the raid starting out, and then all of a sudden they meet Hampton's cavalry at Saponi Church, and wondering what went wrong. And then, of course, the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road unfolds, and we see practically everything went wrong.
So, it's interesting. I think the Wilson Couts raid is a very fascinating event that transpires during this period, because it's separate, but it is a part of the overall operation itself. And what is interesting to me is James Wilson. At this point, he's a part of the Union cavalry, and this raid does not turn out the way he clearly expects. He's very upset about it. And then I have read August Kautz's own reports and memory about it. August Kautz, for some reason, saw this whole thing as successful. He actually considered it the most important part of his career. Now, I don't know if that has anything to do with the fact that this raid is named partly after him or not, but I was kind of curious as to your take as to why Wilson viewed it as an abject failure versus Couts, who saw it as very important. I'm just kind of curious about your take on that.
Well, Wilson was the overall commander, and the route at First Stream Station, he never seemed to get over it.
Okay.
Couts didn't do too badly at First Stream Station, and he broke out a different way than Wilson. Most of the men lost were probably Wilson's men, and Kautz's men escaped with much fewer losses. He got back to Federal lines on the 29th, the evening of the Battle of First Stream Station, whereas it took Wilson 2 more days to get 2 more. He didn't get back till July 1st.
Oh, wow. Okay. So one of the other things that you noted on this raid specifically was the significant number of enslaved people escaping with the Union raiders. How did you approach the experience of these non-combatants with the narrative, the event itself? So, in other words, what was the significance of incorporating this into the actual story?
Well, I took what I found, which consisted of accounts by Federals and Federal soldiers, and accounts by Confederate soldiers and Confederate civilians. And in the big picture, I had to remember that part of the effect of the raid was to interfere with the labor force down there in Southwest Virginia, and it
Huh.
interfered with the harvest of the crops, because so many contrabands were freed.
So it did not have to necessarily do with just breaking up the railroads behind Petersburg. It was
Well,
more
I
than
don't know that the freeing, the liberation of the slaves was a primary goal, but it wound up to be a major damage point for the Confederates in Southside Virginia.
okay. So clearly, a lot of the engagements that took place during this offensive, uh, it didn't really go that well tactically for the Union. So you present Grant is maintaining the strategic initiative, even when these tactical results go against him. So then, what was the evidence of this interpretation, and why the breakdown at the tactical level?
Well, General Grant basically um, delegated almost everything to General Meade, and the breakdown occurred because of General Meade's impatience. I mean, the critical breakdown was because of General Meade's impatience. General Meade started out with the good idea of moving the Second and Sixth Corps together, but that proved impossible because, let's put it this way, it couldn't be done on June 22nd. It would have had to wait another day because the Sixth Corps could not get two of its three divisions out of the trenches in daylight because they were under cannon fire from the other side of the Appomattox River. And that was a problem. And another thing is, I pointed out that, well, they're sending a cavalry raid out. Yet why are they trying to move their infantry before the cavalry? Because when General Grant sent out Sheridan on the Trevilian raid, General Lee sent out cavalry to follow him. And that's what happened with the Wilson and Kautz raid. Wilson and Kautz's divisions left Petersburg, and Rooney Lee's division followed them. If General Meade had waited another day before he launched the infantry on its mission, Behringer's brigade wouldn't have been there. It pursued Wilson and Kautz throughout the whole raid. It was fighting Wilson and Kautz, what was left of Behringer's brigade, because by that time it had been whittled down by horse attrition to 300 men. On the June 29th at First Ream Station, it was engaged from there. So Behringer's brigade stopped Barlow's division on the 21st of June, then participated in the Battle of the Grove or Nottoway Courthouse on the 23rd, then participated in the Battle of Staunton River Bridge on the 25th. It rode 300 miles behind Wilson's men during the raid.
Wow. Okay, so it kind of sounds like there's some miscommunication going on among the officers. Do you think that there are some interpersonal relationships that impacted the operational and some of the tactical outcomes during this offensive?
Well, there was General Meade's order to Birney and Barlow to move without reference to Sixth Corps on the early morning of June 22nd. That was the fatal order that wrecked the whole. When Mahone took advantage of that wrecked the whole offensive. And on the Wilson and Kautz communicated sufficiently. They differed about what the objective, where they would head for. Kautz would have preferred to go to North Carolina. Wilson was determined to get back to the Army of the Potomac. And let's see, actually, there was more confusion on the Confederate side, particularly on June 22nd, when General Mahone had his plan for flanking the Second Corps, and he wanted Wilcox's division to form up on his right, and he had a path for Wilcox's division to get there. He sent the plan to A.P. Hill, the Corps commander, and carrying the plan was Victor Girardi, one of the great staff officers of the war. And he was a captain then. And Girardi explained the plan to Hill, who misunderstood the plan. And why, I don't know. Maybe, Girardi was originally a French native. He was a French native who relocated. Maybe it had something to do with Girardi's accent. I don't really know. Anyway, Girardi was so conscientious that he didn't stop with communicating the plan to Hill. He proceeded out to Wilcox and communicated the plan to Wilcox. So when later on, Hill came out to Wilcox to tell him what to do, and Hill gave orders to Wilcox based on his misunderstanding of Mahone's plan. So Wilcox had to decide, well, do I listen to the Captain Girardi, or do I listen to the Lieutenant General Hill? Well, that wasn't a difficult question. That wasn't hard to answer for Wilcox. He was a professional, so he followed Hill's version. Unfortunately, that led Wilcox pretty much due north into Federal lines rather than northwest, which would have taken him fairly quickly to Mahone's right. And if he'd formed up on Mahone's right, the Confederates probably would have captured 500 to 1,000 more prisoners instead of the 1,600 they got from Mahone's move against the Federal open flank.
Wow. So after the Confederates are actually able to exploit the Second Corps, the Second Corps, obviously they're flanked, they lose lots of men, and how many Confederates again were able to actually roll up the Union flank?
Well, I'd say fewer than 3,000.
Wow. So you have fewer than 3,000 rolling up the Union flank. What then is going on with the Sixth Corps further south of their position at this point?
Well, it took the Sixth Corps till early in the two entrenched divisions of the Sixth Corps till about 4 o'clock in the morning of June 22nd to get out of the trenches and march toward the Federal left. And then they just had to stop and camp and eat. They had to sleep and eat because they'd been awake for 2 nights and they hadn't eaten that evening. So it took them till the afternoon of June 22nd to deploy. And that's what kept them from coming up on the left of the Second Corps. I didn't cover, I haven't covered the miscommunication among the Confederate cavalrymen as well. At Second Ream Station, when Wilson's men took off to the southwest and headed towards Jarrett Station to cross back towards the Army of the Potomac, this is June 29th, Hampton's men were not far away, but Fitzhugh Lee didn't communicate with Hampton. I think Fitzhugh Lee's nose was probably out of joint because Hampton was in charge of the cavalry, and General Lee himself was responsible for the problem. He should have put Hampton in charge immediately. Instead, both Fitzhugh Lee and Wade Hampton were communicating directly for orders from General Lee, whereas there was no corps commander of the cavalry at the time. So it probably cost them another 500 to 1,000 prisoners they would have taken if Wade Hampton had been able to get ahead of Wilson, as he would have been able to do if Fitzhugh Lee had kept him apprised of what was going on at First Stream Station.
So just for clarification then, basically their command structure was somewhat similar to the same structure it was with both Grant and Meade. They were of equal rank, and so they were both expecting orders from Lee.
Lee subsequently appointed Hampton commander of the cavalry corps. That position was empty. Okay, so it was a unique situation that resulted from the failure to fill Stuart's shoes after he died.
Okay. Well, I know that there was probably also some miscommunication going on between Wright and Meade. Not too long after the Second Corps falls back is the Sixth Corps advances towards the Weldon Railroad. Do you want to explain that just a little bit more?
I wouldn't characterize it as miscommunication. It was insubordination. And it was the same kind of insubordination that got Warren into hot water at Spotsylvania and on June 18th in front of Petersburg. He didn't follow peremptory orders to attack. And Meade was out there with Wright, demanding that he attack, and Wright wouldn't do it. And Meade wouldn't sack him, and just as he wouldn't sack Warren.
So why? Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's enough.
So then what do you think, what's your interpretation then as to why Wright wouldn't attack? Because, Horatio Wright, this is my own opinion, so take it with a grain of salt here, but, it seems like he has a little bit of a mixed record. I mean, he seems aggressive in some places. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, I thought he did just fine. But why now? Why the hesitation?
Well, remember, he was hesitating on June 23rd, the day after the Second Corps had just been routed and flanked in the woods west of Petersburg. And I think he feared the same result.
And so then why do you think Meade wouldn't sack him?
Meade wouldn't sack him. Meade was reluctant to sack anybody. I think I don't know why he didn't sack people. He had Grant's permission to sack Warren twice, and he didn't do it. John Selby wrote a biography of Meade and pointed out that Meade let his subordinates run over him.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that before. That's okay. So clearly, Lee wins several sharp engagements. I mean, it's impressive, quite frankly, what they do at the tactical level. I mean, they're defeating larger numbers than they have in the past. I mean, it seems like they have a lot of success. So why are those victories insufficient to really alter the strategic situation then?
Well, at that point, the Federal Army is huge and much bigger than Lee's force at Petersburg. Lee does attempt to counterattack, but it's it was a bad idea and it wasn't implemented correctly. On June 24th, near the Hare House, Beauregard and Lee cooked up this plan to retake the fortifications that the Federals had captured on June 15th through June 18th. But the two brigadiers who were to lead the way didn't understand their respective roles, and nobody really was appointed to command the whole thing. So Lee called it off after it didn't get off the ground.
Was the Union line there? Was it strong? Was it well fortified, or was it a good place for an attack to be made?
It was fortified, and they were relatively rested. So General Lee had in my opinion, a slow learning curve, because he never learned to stop attacking fortifications. He attacked in the same region on March 25th, 1865 at Fort Stedman and really got hammered.
Was it difficult for you to actually find sources about the engagement at the Hare House or the counterattack that Lee made on June 24th?
No, that wasn't difficult. That wasn't difficult.
Did you happen to find that? Did you find other previous histories had written much about it?
Well, the official reports are pretty clear about it. And then, of course, there are the individuals involved. There were individual soldiers who left accounts, and it was a very small, it was a single brigade. So it wasn't huge numbers of men like the Second Corps or the Sixth Corps. So it was a much simpler task to write about than the fighting on June 23rd, where Mahone is gradually enveloping about 500 or 600 Vermonters, or on June 22nd, which was totally chaotic.
You know, your book is really detailed with the fighting and the engagements and a lot of the explanation. So I think it kind of begs the question of, how did you go about getting all the research for this work?
Well, when I'm working on a history, what I try to do is go down. First of all, I start out with the order of battle, and I look for sources on each of the units involved, as many as I can get, and then I try to digest them and deal with them. Now, there are different ways to digest things. For example, chapter 5 is the story of the rout of Second Corps. Well, it's really a lot of anecdotes strung together, because it's very, I mean, you can write about the chaos very simply in a couple of sentences, but when you get down into the weeds, it's all kinds of individual strange stories. The details are unique to each person whose account you get. So that's the way I decided to present that. In other words, every account I could get, I put together. First Barlow's division, then Mott's division, then Gibbon's division.
You know, one of the coolest things I always tend to find when I'm talking to historians about their research is they always tend to find some really interesting story that just really sticks with them. And I'm curious, when you were conducting this research, were there any particular stories that any soldier had mentioned that just really stuck out to you?
Well, in a way, the critical story is the story of Lieutenant Colonel, let's see, I can't remember his name right now, but he was the lieutenant colonel in command of the 61st Virginia. He wrote a book called A Pair of Blankets, and he was right at the very critical point of the June 22nd fight. He was when Mahone first attacked Barlow. Barlow had 2 brigades in a return for just such a purpose, and Mahone attacked first with 2 brigades, and they were repulsed. Then Mahone committed his old brigade under Whitaker, which wrapped itself around the left of the Federal brigade at the end of the return, McDougall's brigade. And it wrapped in such a way that the 61st Virginia was right at the point of turning the Federal line. The 61st was in the middle of Mahone's brigade. And this officer describes how he had to fight with a shovel, hitting Federals with it. And as the Mahone's old brigade wrapped itself around the Federal left. And that's what pried the Federal left loose and resulted in the rout.
It's almost ironic that he's fighting them with a shovel based upon how all the entrenchments that were built. I mean, there's almost a metaphor or something to be said about that.
Well, at that point, they weren't dug in.
Right. No, it's just when you said that, that's immediately what I thought of. So I really enjoyed so much of your book, but I'm actually going to ask this question a little bit selfishly because this is the part of your story that I really liked. It's a very small part, but I find it important. You mentioned Grant's desire to actually build a bridgehead at Deep Bottom. Why does he do this if Petersburg is actually the objective? And does it actually have wider implications when we're talking about Petersburg? I mean, what's the significance of adding this to the story?
Well, of course, it's going to play a big role for the rest of the offensive, the rest of the siege. And the funny thing is that bringing the railroad bridges under fire and seizing the Deep Bottom bridgehead were the 2 main achievements of the second offensive, and they were there for the taking. The Confederates couldn't have stopped them. General Heath, when he was fighting at the Deep Bottom bridgehead, said, "What's the point of me seizing this? Because they can cross downriver whenever they please." So it was the easy pickings, the low-hanging fruit were the bridges to be brought under fire and for the Deep Bottom bridgehead to be seized. And the Deep Bottom bridgehead functioned in the 3rd offensive, in the 4th offensive, 5th offensive, 6th offensive, and it even to the end of the Petersburg campaign, there were men tied up there, and they kept Confederates tied up there who could have been deployed to the advantage of the Confederates, but they General Lee couldn't be sure that that many Federals had moved south of the river.
So then what do you think are some of the key strategic lessons? Maybe it could come from them taking the bridgehead, but anything overall, really. What do you think are some key strategic lessons that actually come from the second offensive at Petersburg then?
Well, patience is a virtue. And General Meade lacked patience. And if he'd been more patient, fewer Federals would have been captured by the Confederates on June 22nd. As far as that's probably the moral of the story, that patience is a virtue, and that General Meade was lacking in patience at the worst time. I know what I want to get back to. General Colonel Lyman, who was on Meade's staff, said of General Wright on June 23rd that he wasn't fit to command a corps. But nonetheless, Lyman defends, and Lyman is very sympathetic to Meade, who is his commander and probably his personal friend. But wow, Meade, that was Meade's low point on June 22nd.
So then, really, to what extent then should Meade be held responsible for the failures of the second offensive? Do you think in the past he's been judged where he should be, or do you think he's been judged too leniently?
He's in a tough position. I think part of his reluctance to, well, I shouldn't say this. There's no reason for him to have been reluctant to sack Warren, but I think that Meade knew he was not part of Grant's inner circle, and he was always worried that he was going to be replaced as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was concerned that Hancock would replace him, and he just did not feel secure doing anything. I don't know why he didn't sack Warren. I can see why he might not sack Wright, because he hadn't gotten permission from Grant to sack Wright. But with Warren was an old Army of the Potomac man, and maybe Meade felt that, I'm just speculating now, maybe Meade felt that, well, if I sack him, it's one less old Army of the Potomac guy. So that's all I can think he might have thought. But he was responsible for he and Humphreys were responsible for the main failures of the offensive.
Just out of curiosity, I didn't write this question down, but I'm somewhat curious. So I'm going to rewind just a little bit. So Wilson and Kautz were supposed to meet back up with the Union at the Weldon Railroad. They were supposed to capture the Weldon Railroad. They were supposed to hold it so that way the cavalry could get across. And Sheridan was actually supposed to go and support them. Do you think if Sheridan actually would have gotten off to go do that, do you think they actually would have gotten back without significant loss? Okay.
Wilson and Kautz started out by crossing the Weldon Railroad. Then they went out to Burkeville, down to Staunton River Bridge, and then back to near the Weldon Railroad at Saponi Church. If Sheridan had engaged Hampton, Wilson and Kautz would have gotten home free. But Sheridan had the slows big time.
Yeah. And how do you think do you think this would have altered the interpretation of the raid? How would you balance the success versus the losses of that raid? Because it seems like had Sheridan actually gotten there, had they had not lost that many men, it would have, it seems like it would have been interpreted as successful, but it didn't seem worth the loss. Would you consider that a fair assessment?
Well, it was of modest success at best. And Wilson exaggerated its success. For some reason, historians are fond of quoting General St. John, who made a comment to Wilson supposedly after the war that this had been a terrible blow to the Confederacy. But the fact is, the Weldon Railroad was up and running within a week of when the Sixth Corps finished it. In other words, it had been repaired since June 22nd, when Wilson and Kautz crossed it and ripped up a little bit of it. And then the Sixth Corps came on down there on the 29th and 30th, too late to save Wilson and Kautz at First Ream Station, and ripped it up again. But it was running soon afterward. It was running by the 6th or 7th of July. And likewise, the South Side Railroad was running by July 4th. The only railroad that took a while to repair was the Richmond and Danville. And when the Confederates repaired it, they rebuilt it with better rail than it had started out with. So in the sense, the raid didn't really produce much. It didn't really do much damage to the railroads, and it was quickly repaired, much more quickly repaired than Wilson has. People are still quoting that statement by Isaac St. John, but I went through record after record about when they started to run, and it was much sooner than St. John indicated.
I'm going to just switch gears just a little bit. So one of the things that you noted particular, especially more toward the end of your book, is casualty analysis of the second offensive. You really break down those numbers really, really well. What did those numbers reveal that narrative sources did not?
Well, the numbers revealed the disproportionate casualties, but the Federals suffered almost 3 times as many infantry casualties in the Battle of Jerusalem Plank Road, and they suffered about almost 5 times as many cavalry casualties during the Wilson and Kautz raid. It also reveals, well, I count prisoners, and the analysts that I started out with, Livermore and Dupuy, don't. And I thought that's wrong with the campaign of 1864, where the Convention for Exchange of Prisoners had broken down, and a prisoner was as good as a dead man for the rest of the campaign. And indeed, half of the prisoners seized in June by the Confederates probably died in captivity, because the fellow Dr. Cross, who wrote the book on the Vermont Brigade, studied what happened to the men who were captured on June 23rd, and half of them died in captivity. So I sort of extrapolate from there and assume that that was the death ratio among the other prisoners. By the way, let me just say, Greg Eanes's book was very helpful on the Wilson and Kautz raid. And getting back to the 61st Virginia, the officer in question was William H. Stewart, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Stewart. So I looked that up on my phone while we were talking.
Hey, that's okay. No, that's great. So if Confederate forces, again, I might be just beating a dead horse at this point, who knows, but if Confederate forces are inflicting these disproportionate casualties at times, again, why does that not translate into strategic leverage for Lee? And maybe it does, right? I mean, I don't know how much of this, I don't know if you found anything about how, if this impacted how the North viewed, like the Northern public viewed this particular offensive, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I don't think the Northern public got much out of the offensive, but I think that it had an overall effect, in the sense that the Federals were reluctant to move, reluctant to move out into the territory south of Petersburg, and they kept farther away from the Confederate fortifications, so they had to cover a lot more ground. In other words, looking at the map, you'll see that moving directly west from Jerusalem Plank Road, say a mile south of the Demock line, is a much shorter route than going all the way out to Globe Tavern and moving 2 miles out. It increases the amount of territory that the Federals have to cover. Also, the General Meade was a very passive defensive commander, and he had his men spending so much time digging fortifications because the Federals built a very complicated line that doubled back so that they could defend themselves against a flanking move, that by November, Warren and Hancock were complaining to Meade that their troops were untrained because they were spending so much time digging.
Again, it goes back to that shovel.
And you can see it in the mass surrenders in well, not the crater, but on August 19th, also then at Keeble's Farm, after they penetrate towards the Weldon Railroad, there's a counterattack that gobbles up about 1,000 Federals. Then north of the James on the 20, well, of course that doesn't matter. We're talking about south of the James. But the Federals spent so much time fortifying south of the James that they weren't training their men as infantry. They weren't training their recruits as infantrymen properly.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. So,
that was Earl Hess pointed out that in his book on the trenches at Petersburg. That was very helpful.
Okay. Well, as we start to wrap things up here, I have one more question for you, which is, if you could change one prevailing assumption about this offensive, Grant, Meade, Lee, or Petersburg, what would it be and why?
Well, I generally tell people the fighting at Petersburg was largely outside the trenches. It was at the point where the Federals were trying to extend around the Confederate left or the Confederate right. And it was done mostly out on the flanks, and it was usually not in prepared positions. So it was a lot more dynamic than the trench warfare stereotype that a lot of people have about Petersburg.
I thought of one more question.
Sure.
So we've talked about Petersburg as a siege. And I think there's a prevailing controversy about it being a siege. And I'm just curious, in your opinion, if you do think it's a siege or not, and why.
Well, sure, it's a siege because, see, I don't think of a siege as requiring complete investment. People confuse investment with siege. A full investment is not necessary to conduct a siege. Yes, it's extremely helpful. Look at right now I'm writing about Vicksburg, where an incident at Vicksburg where it's clear that time's running out on the Confederates. Well, that's why, in a way, that's why General Lee bugged out as soon as the Federals reached the river above the city on April 2nd, 1865. He didn't want to be fully invested within Richmond and Petersburg because he knew that was the end. So I have no problem with the idea of a siege. A word is how people use it. There are plenty of instances that are called sieges where the investment was not complete. I believe Antioch in the 11th century, the Crusaders were besieged. It's where you're in a position where you can take the place close enough to take the place by storm. And Grant was close enough to take Petersburg by storm, even though he hadn't fully invested it.
Well, I'm in complete agreement with you. But As we wrap things up, again, I'm here with John Horn, author of Lee Besieged. Thank you so much for coming on today, John. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Nathan.
Yeah. Well, if you like today's episode, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button for more. And I'll make sure to see you all next time.